Hello, everyone. It's David Leis, your proud host of Leaders on the Frontier, and it is Thursday, January the 16th, 2025, the year of our Lord, and we're so grateful to welcome everyone to our conversation today on Leaders on the Frontier. We talk to a lot of fine people across the nation as we talk about important issues to all Canadians, and we certainly welcome your feedback. And on that note, I just want to thank everyone for, their participation in so many ways. I mean, I think last week we had just dozens and dozens of comments and questions and insights, and we really appreciated your participation. So thank you, everyone. And speaking of which, we hope we're serving you, the audience, with both information but also thoughtful commentary about the policies that make our nation so successful. And today we're going to be talking about our country, Canada, and is it broken? And you may think that that's maybe an overstatement, or maybe you think that's right on. But we want to hear about your comments because, sincerely, we have a very special guest that I think will add considerably to our conversation and insight about our nation. And he's going to share a lot based on his extensive experience serving in our armed forces, serving different levels of government, including in emergency planning. But this conversation is so timely in 2025. Again, it's only January the 16th. The year has just begun, and there is so much going on. We could highlight many things, including, well, after 15 months, we have a hostage deal in the Middle East. That's something to rejoice on. It sounds like it's a very positive development as it relates to the release of hostages. It's hard to believe after all this time that there are still hostages to be released. What a tragedy. And different prisoners. So we'll monitor that very carefully. And so a warm welcome to all of you for joining us. And if you think this conversation is important, please like it, share it. That's how the word gets out, because we want to help the public square, the place where there's all these discussions. And it's interesting. Marie Cameron says, yes, and this is response to the question, is our nation broken, Canada? Yes, it is broken and critically divided. So thank you, Marie, and good afternoon, Prairie. And welcome back again this week. So let's turn to our conversation, because as we are in 2025, we can reflect, all of us, on the state of our nation. You may have your own personal story and reflection about how people are struggling to, say, buy their groceries, to work at their place of employment. They may be concerned about our state of our nation. And so I want to welcome a special guest today. He's an associate of Frontier. His name is Lieutenant Colonel David Redman. And David, a warm welcome to you today.
Hi, David, and thank you very much for having me.
David, it's so great to see you, because you've served internationally around the country. How many missions have you served on, David? Just recap that for us.
Well, in 27 years in the Army, my wife and I and our 3 children lived in 19 houses, spread over 3 tours in Europe, a tour in the United States, and all across the great country of Canada, as well as operational tours in Egypt and the former Republic of Yugoslavia throughout the Middle East.
Well, it's quite a record of active service. Why did you choose to do that kind of service for our country, David?
That's an interesting question, because I joined the Army in 1972, and it wasn't a very popular time to join the Army. You'll remember the Vietnam War was still raging. It was on its winding down, but we still had draft dodgers coming up to where I lived in Victoria, BC. And so my choice was, to say the least, not looked favorably on by many of my classmates. I joined because, I don't know, I was the only one of the children in my family that chose to do it, but both my mother and my father had served in uniform in World War II. My dad was an NCO pilot in the Pacific. My mother was ultimately a sergeant in the Royal Air Force Women's Corps, WAF, and in the RCAF, and she was posted overseas, in fact, in Gander, Newfoundland, which in the time wasn't part of Canada. I had always, from the age of 8, only ever wanted to be a soldier in the Army. And my parents, because of their past, strongly encouraged me to join as an officer, so I did. But to me, service to the country and what I had seen from my parents and all my aunts and uncles, it was something that I looked forward to and wanted.
Well, it's really interesting to hear your story, David. And I know that you made a real difference as well as other forms of service, because you've also served as a leader preparing this country for emergencies or disasters. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. After the Army, when I left in anger, I must say, in 1999 against what was being done to the Canadian Armed Forces by the government of that day, I ultimately in 2020 found employment with Emergency Management Alberta, as it was called then. It's now the Alberta Emergency Management Agency. But I first was employed as the Director of Community Programs, helping municipalities respond to major emergencies and disasters, bringing provincial government support to them. But then September the 11th, 2001 happened, and by September the 12th, I had been moved and assigned as the leader to write the Alberta Counterterrorism Crisis Management Plan and to implement it over the next 2 years, and then ultimately to become the head of AEMA, responding to fires, floods, tornadoes, and terrorism. And in that role, wrote a lot, didn't write, but led the team that wrote the pandemic influenza plan of that year with the Deputy Minister of Health. So worked my way across all of the possible hazards in our province and in our country. After that, I then became involved as a contractor working both sides of the border in emergency management extensively in the US and Canada.
So it's a fascinating background, and it's interesting going back a few years ago. I think our paths crossed with the land of frontier, where it was fascinating how you were involved, and maybe this is something that we don't want to miss here, is that you were involved in preparing emergency plans for a number of scenarios, whether it's terrorism, natural disasters, including a pandemic. So there was a pandemic plan, David,
Yes.
and we didn't follow it. Is that the short answer?
13 out of 13 provinces and territories had pandemic influenza plans in 2020, as well as the federal government. And in my opinion, we threw them all out the window because those plans were based on a collective knowledge that had been put together for over 20 years in order to respond, creating the least disruption to society while protecting those most at risk. And we completely did the opposite, and we went after our whole society. What we now call lockdowns was in fact the use of the 15 non-pharmaceutical interventions, which had been studied for 2 decades. And in almost every case, it was known that they caused far more harm than good. And unfortunately, I believe we're still seeing and will see for decades to come the terrible outcomes of the use of those non-pharmaceutical interventions. So just to be clear, things like wearing masks, school closures, closures of business, border closures, social distancing, all of those had been studied for 20 years, and all of them had been strongly recommended against because of the damages they do.
Okay, so you may think that, you may be puzzled. Why am I asking this question about COVID-19 and disaster plans? Because, well, I would suggest it's all interrelated, isn't it? Our topic is Canada broken? And it relates to purpose and vision, but also working together as a team to plan and build our country. So is that a fair question? Like, I mean, this is all interrelated, is it not, David?
I strongly believe that the government overreach that we saw provincially, territorially, and federally during the COVID pandemic has simply been a forerunner to what we've seen for all 9 years in our country right now that's led us to where we are now, where we see that the unity of our country is daily questioned, that the national security of our country has got to the point that our allies shun us and ignore us, where trust in our basic electoral system and foreign interference in it is talked openly in the media, where our rights and freedoms have been constantly trampled, where our economic well-being and growth is a joke at this point in time, and personal well-being and societal well-being have been completely disrupted and broken when we're seeing large cases of mental health and societal health issues in our society. And those are the 6 defining national interests of a country. And so I believe we've seen all 6 directly attacked and denigrated over the past period of time.
Okay, so there you have it. That's quite a brilliant summary. As I counted them, you referenced at least 12 items right there that summarize the state of our nation. And so I'm asking the audience, what do you think? Is that a fair analysis? And what should we do about it? We're going to talk about that today. My guest is Lieutenant Colonel David Redman. And thank you for your comments. Tom Marazzo. Hello, Tom. Great guest. Thank you so much for your kind comment. And so this conversation is going to be far-reaching, folks. So please get in your questions. Send us your likes. We'd very much appreciate it. Because when we talk about this conversation, David, I recall well back in March of last year, you wrote a brilliant paper about the future of Canada in 2024, and it was titled Confident, Resilient Nation or a Fearful, Fractured Country. And it was a hard-hitting paper. You can see it on the Frontier website. And Matthew says, thanks again for doing this. This was a paper that I think caught the imagination of a lot of different audiences who said, yeah, we got to get the basics right here as a nation as we think about the purpose, the vision of what we're building here as a country. And have we forgotten our history about why this nation was founded? And so as we look to 2025, this is even up another notch as we see, well, these tweets from Donald Trump. And we can show one of these where he talks about Canada joining the country as a 51st state there. There's again, he's overlooking what looks like the Rocky Mountains. I keep saying it's really the Matterhorn in Switzerland, but that's beside the point. Are we going to just go quietly into the night as a nation if we've lost our purpose and our commitment and get out of our complacency? David, is this situation now in 2025 that much worse than even a year ago?
I absolutely believe it is, but I think we walked our way down to this point over a number of decades, but in the last decade, extremely quickly. But maybe just to have a very quick sort of historical view of this same sort of an issue. I mean, if you go back to the formation of Canada in 1867, the Americans to the south had just finished a very bloody civil war, and they had this huge standing army. And at that time, there was a group that strongly professed in a doctrine called the Manifest Destiny. And the Manifest Destiny was nothing short of Americans believing that the entire North American continent belonged to them and that it was only a matter of time until they took it. And so when Sir John A. Formed our country, it was with that direct threat in mind and built it into a country that did not want to be simply subsumed into the United States. We had survived the War of 1812. Now, if you look at it historically, we've been through these same sort of challenges under the first Pierre Trudeau government back when he tried to remove us from NATO, and there was a direct linkage between trade and our national security. It happened again after September 11th when Paul Cellucci repeatedly said security trumps trade. So what we're seeing now is just once more the concept of manifest destiny rearing its head, and Canada either steps up or there will be consequences.
Okay, so that's the historical context that you are highlighting, David. This notion that we are truly next door neighbors to both a friend, but realistically, it is a superpower. And so they are really following up on their interests to govern the United States for the benefit of Americans. So this is really quite a challenge then for this country as we say, well, how are we going to manage these kinds of overtures for, again, a reassertion of that manifest destiny? Is that right, David?
It absolutely is. And that's why I challenged Canadians back last March, and Frontier was kind enough to publish my paper, and a lot of people picked it up. Because Canadians need to decide, as I said, it was my closing and opening comment. Every nation has an army, theirs or somebody else's. And without a clear 25-year vision for where we would love our country to be in the future, we are handing to our politicians the use of daily issues and divisive issues to fracture our country into smaller and smaller pieces, none of which link to a vision of our country that is strong and resilient 25 years from now. And so I redefined it back again the way I had been taught in military college into the 6 defining national interests of a country. And I'm very happy to go into them in detail. But in the paper, I cover them. And the whole point of the 6 national interests is they're long-range visions that require complete groups of people to come together to define, to work on, and to pull the country forward. And Canadians need to choose politicians who have a clear, defined vision for our country, not as a post-national state, but as a proud, strong, independent nation in the world, or else we will be simply part of somebody else's nation. And I put it to you that it's not necessarily in the short term, even the United States. We see foreign interference from China happening every single day in the streets of our country. So we need to realize that there is a clear and present danger in our country happening on our streets right now.
All right. So you are challenging us to kind of get our house in order. And, you know, it's interesting in your paper last year, it was interesting. You cited 1967, the 100-year anniversary of the founding of this incredible country, as a kind of a seminal moment where there was a unified vision or set of values, you know, working together as a country. There was a strong economy. There was a kind of a pride in our history and culture and a vibrant democracy, you said. And you know, a lot of people thought in 1967, David, that the next century was going to be Canada's. Is that right?
I wrote the paper from the point of view of 2 groups of people. Myself as a teenager in 1967, looking at an incredible centennial year and all of the pride in our country that was expressed across our entire nation, but from other nations looking at Canada even more importantly. And then I wrote it from the second point of view, which is my 6 grandchildren, who are now all over 18 years old, starting out into our country in their walks of life, and through their eyes, looking at the Canada they see right now. And that's why I devoted into 2 parts, the confident country or a fearful country. And I want my grandchildren to have that confident country back. Because in 1967, if you think about it, think about all the things. Our economy was thriving. Other foreign nations looked at Canada as the place to be, and it was they who said the next 100 years belongs to Canada. We were coming out of being just a resource-based economy into truly a manufacturing and resource-based economy with so many things to look forward to in our economic prosperity, but we were seen from the outside as this strong, unified country that truly believed in itself and had stepped up repeatedly from World War II, from World War I on, to make sure that we defended our borders, we took our national security seriously, and we're ready to step onto the world stage in a confident manner.
So that is a powerful summation of 1967. But I'm going to ask you, the audience, do you think Lieutenant Colonel David Redman is making any sense here? Because I think one of the questions that strikes me here, David, is the question, what is a nation? Is that what maybe that's another way to get at this question, is what is a nation? And we need to answer that question, renew our commitment to being a nation, today in 2025?
So one of the simplest ways to define a nation, and you can look it up in all the different dictionaries, but it's when a culturally solid group of people live in a geography with defined and defended borders. Very simple definition. So the first two national interests, a common culture based on common ethics and values within a defended piece of geography that they call their country. Now, I want to take you back to a point I made earlier. When I joined the Canadian military and I went through the military college system, one of the things that was required of us as aspiring young officers was that we learned the 6 major national interests of our country and were able to define them and talk about them intelligently. And so just to run through them very quickly again, to put them in our audience mind, because I want to keep referring to them as unity, national security, good governance, rights and freedoms, clearly because we're a democracy, economic well-being and growth, and individual and societal well-being. So the first two, unity and national security, are the 2 paramount national interests of a country, because without them, the other 4 simply fall to pieces. So when we were taught as young officers the reason we were taught them is we knew we were going to be wearing a patch on our shoulder that said Canada, and we were going to be deployed all over the world, and we needed to be able to talk to people about why we were in their country and what we were there to either help or to assist in. And so I want Canadians to understand that those 6 national interests define our country, and we need to demand that politicians clearly and authoritatively can talk about each of the 6 and where they see those in 25 years. Because if we don't, we're handing the tools to our politicians not to pull our country forward, but to split it into pieces.
Okay, so I think you've hit the nail on the head here. We've got some very interesting comments. Marie Cameron says, David is right on the mark. I remember my grandmother saying that Canada was the breadbasket of the world at that time. So thank you, Marie, for that comment. And I find it interesting, David, the way you summarize those 6 national interests. And the first one that you emphasize as foundational is unity.
Yes.
So what I find interesting is maybe I have 2 questions here. The first one is, how do we, from a public policy point of view, engender unity in this country? And secondly, doesn't that all point back to us as citizens that we, as you were alluding to, need to demand that our leadership is aligned with those interests, and they better have good answers to these questions? Is that what you're getting at?
The first one quickly first. Yes, that's exactly what we need to demand of our politicians. But let's talk specifically about unity, because we've heard our current Prime Minister say we're a post-national state. We've also heard him say that there is no defining culture in our country. I strongly disagree with both those points, that there is no such thing as a post-national state, and I can explain later why. But let's talk about unity as a principle. Unity is when a group of people come together and share common ethics and common values. The word culture keeps getting thrown in, and the Prime Minister said we don't even have one. I've written a paper on it saying strongly we do have a defining culture, but it's based on the common ethics and values that make our country. The reason I set culture to a side is you can have multiple cultures in a country, but only if those cultures have the same ethics and values. And I always use Switzerland when I'm talking about it, because Switzerland has an Italian culture, a French culture, and a German culture, all in one country. But each of those 3 groups share the common ethics and values that define them as a unified country. Canada is a country that has a strong history, a brilliant history that got us to where we are. We're one of the first countries in the world that recognized women as people, as it was called back at the time. 50% of our country, we strongly believe in the shared values of women as equals. We see many countries in the world that don't share that ethical value, and don't practice it in their own country. And we should not bring that type of ideology into our country. We believe that women are equals in every sense of the word. And I believe in equality, but not in DEI, because equality means you treat everybody with respect and dignity, which is another of our Canadian ethics and values, and why we were able for so many years to stand on the world stage and be seen as someone to go to help resolve international problems, which we're not anymore. So unity is the cornerstone, along with national security. With those first two national interests well defined, we can move forward. But until we have leadership in this country that is capable to stand up and define what the ethics and values of Canadians are, we will continue to be fragmented into smaller and smaller groups. I don't know if it's just me, but I can't hear you, David.
Sorry, my apologies. What I'm seeing is a lot of great comments from our audience saying thank you for such a great guest from Wanda Jane. Thank you, Wanda. And from Prairie, I see a lot of clapping hands and 100%. So thank you for your comments. David, so unity is foundational here. The good book says a divided house will not stand. And so it goes for not only families and organizations, but for a nation. So let's join hands together and build this incredible country. I mean, that's how it came together. It's stunning, if you know anything about Canadian history, about how this has come together, both ancient and current modern Canada, is how people even built the railway. It's incredible. And no nation is perfect, but this is an incredible country. And that's why people come from all over the world to come here. So that's our context. So we're really challenged, aren't we? And when you talk about culture, I guess, David, to be very blunt, I think you've articulated well the case that, yeah, we welcome all kinds of cultures, but we got to be unified. So this whole idea about multiculturalism is kind of a crazy policy, is it not?
I believe that multiculturalism worldwide, but particularly in Canada, is a failure. And let me explain. Multiculturalism is defined by trying to keep people proud in their separate cultures. So if you're coming to Canada because you believe in the totality of the beautiful Canadian culture, why would you want to stay in separate groups? And when it was first established in our country, backed by Pierre Trudeau, he intentionally put government-funded money, that means taxpayers' money, to give to these groups to keep them in separate groups. That's exactly the opposite of what should be happening. When someone has chosen to come to a new country, no matter what that country is, they do so knowing full well what that country stands for and represents. And if they come knowing that and wanting to join into it and to be part of the same ethics and values that they were seeing from afar, wonderful. If they come knowing those ethics and values and don't want to adopt them, then they're an enemy of the state. There's no other way of putting it, because the only reason they came is to destroy those ethics and values. And so, in my point of view, the way I see the world is Canada is a welcoming country and has welcomed people from all over the world and should continue to do so in a controlled and managed fashion. And we'll talk about a little more in a second, but we welcome anyone who sees what Canada stands for and see what we believe as the rights and freedoms of the people of our country, and we welcome anyone who wants to celebrate and join in them. So when I go back to the point on immigration, I believe we've seen mass uncontrolled immigration in many groups coming into our country, particularly in the last 4 years. So if someone asks me, I always say it is time for a 1-year freeze on immigration, not being prejudiced against any group, simply saying we need a year to step back, decide what we want to be the ethics and values of our country again, and establish a clear and firm immigration policy to allow people to join our country in a quantity that they can immigrate and become part of our society, not flood our society and take over our society. But we need a 1-year break because right now we already have millions of people in our country that we have lost track of that do not represent our ethics and values. And we see it demonstrated in marches on our streets from so many different groups as we sit here now. So we need to strongly define the unity of our country, its ethics and values, and publicly state that again, and then build it into a strong and coherent immigration policy.
Okay. So there you've heard from our friend, our guest, Lieutenant Colonel David Redman, articulate some very important insights about that file, that policy file on immigration. So we know that we need immigration. That's what's helped build our country, but we need to be smart about it, and we need to be very thoughtful in terms of that policy. So we've got comments here. Tom Morazzo says, I agree. Ethics and values are critical to creating harmony amongst diverging cultures. I wish Canadians focus more on ethics and values instead of focusing on the differences in cultures. So well said, Tom. Cheryl says, really appreciate David Redman. Michael Mellinson says, thanks so much for letting us hear someone speak so eloquently and coherently about Canada. And there's a person named Monkey who says it started in 1982 and has finally culminated in this Confederation is a failed experiment. Time to move on. Well, what do you think about that? Did that start in 82, or has this been bubbling and percolating much longer than that, David? Any thoughts on that?
I think we've seen roller coasters in democracies throughout the history of the world. I think Canada isn't immune to roller coasters in democracy. I think Winston Churchill once said something to the effect of, democracy is the worst form of government other than every other one we've tried so far. Democracy is messy. The biggest key to democracy is a well-informed and engaged public. And until we see our public becoming fully informed and engaged again with our elected officials, I think we can see wandering. But if we can come back to the concept of the public constantly looks for leadership, and they elect people hoping they will represent them and lead our country. And so the type of leadership that I look for is the type of leadership that can define the 6 national interests of our country and can present that 25-year vision of where we're going. And the reason for the 25-year vision is every single policy decision, every single spending initiative has to be able to be shown how it's going to lead us to that point. Now, that 25-year vision changes. So every 5 years, we need to reinvent that discussion, bring Canadians together, represent that 25-year vision that's moved forward 5 more years. And that way we can make government decisions, whether they be municipal, provincial, territorial, or federal, in a coherent manner, with each of the orders of government walking forward to a strong, vibrant, thriving country that we can all be proud of and that we can hand to our children, and in my case, grandchildren, and pass it on for generations to come. Okay,
so I was taught by my parents that your life is dependent on your level of thinking. And it's the same thing with nations. So I think what you're doing, David, I like, is you are challenging us to raise the bar on our level of thinking as a nation and say, these are the key principles. These are the key questions that we need to zero in on. And those 6 are, again, unity, national security, and help us. What are the other ones, audience? David.
Good governance.
Good governance.
Rights and freedoms. Rights and freedoms. Economic well-being and growth, and personal societal well-being. So in the personal and societal well-being, you talk about the individual, you talk about the individual health, but you talk about our healthcare system, you talk about our education and academia. That all fits in the 6th. Okay, so these, now some people may think, oh, this is just a kind of a conceptual kind of conversation. I dare to differ. This is hard hitting in terms of its impacts on every Canadian.
So help us talk about that, David, or maybe the audience can help us as well. We're in a situation where our standard of living is on a significant decline. I looked at the stats last week between the difference in income between an average family in Ontario versus Alabama, and it's a $25,000 difference. Our country is a much poorer nation. I mean, this affects our pocketbooks, our quality of life, the ability of choices that we can make about how we're going to live our lives, doesn't it, David?
Absolutely. So each one of the six needs detailed development and then to be iteratively talked about with Canadians, refined with Canadians, built with Canadians. And so you need to use a logical process. The operational planning process is what I was raised to use, but it's a step-by-step process where you can take each of those national interests, you can subdivide them into tasks given, tasks implied, and you can pull them all apart, and you can get groups of people, smart, intelligent Canadians, to come together and have a vibrant, violent conversation about each of the tasks given and tasks implied to pull it together into a full statement of that national interest. So let's just use, for example, because you're talking economy, and I strongly agree that that is one of the six defining national interests. You can't afford to fund all the other pieces without a vibrant economy. So Canada has always been known as the hewers of wood and the haulers of ore and minerals, and we should be very proud of that. I don't ever want Canada not to be known to be the breadbasket of the world in terms of agriculture, in terms of mining, in terms of all the other pieces of energy, in terms of all of those essential resource materials. But I want us to do the value added in Canada. I want us to be known as a manufacturing nation again. I want us to be known as a country that has embraced technology and is a leader in science, technology, engineering. I want us to have the full pieces of an economy. But I'm a soldier. I'm a retired soldier and a retired emergency manager. There's people out there in every one of those things I've named that knows those industries and knows how to make them solid and thriving. We need to bring together in a coherent manner in our country, probably with government leadership. It would be wonderful if it was, but if not, within independent groups that then demand of our political leaders that we take each of those national interests, pull them apart, refine them, and then present them as a coherent 25-year vision. And in the paper, I talk about a process and I talk about each one of them, and I try and give at least the task given, not the tasks implied. That group is going to pull all those ideas out way better than I have. It's got to be a coherent conversation with leadership so that it can be walked forward in a step-by-step manner. But when I say a violent discussion, I want conflicting ideas, not like what we saw in COVID. I want every opinion to be expressed, evaluated, and built together into a coherent plan. And there will be ideas that fall by the wayside that maybe just haven't come of their time, or maybe they're just a bad idea. And so we need to have that conversation and do a cost-benefit analysis on ideas and put them together for the future.
Okay, so you're calling for a national discussion, a renewal of this country on these key interests. What do you think? What is Lieutenant Colonel David Redman, our guest today, on the right track? Denver Hodge says, would an army, this is an interesting question, would an army be justified in deposing a government if these six interests are willfully neglected? Wow, that's a zinger of a question. What do you think, David?
Absolutely not. I'm an officer from an army that lived in a democracy. What you've just described is a tyranny. And suddenly generals are smarter than the people that were elected to represent our country. We have a process for removing politicians. It's called elections. And we need to put in place, okay, let's talk good governance. One of the six, right? Governance needs to have clear and transparent elections that can be trusted. We don't have that anymore in our country. We need to rebuild that. But one of the things that I was first taught as an officer is I work for the Canadian people. but I do not have the right to depose a government. I take orders from the government of the day, but I don't have the right to depose them unless they give me, and never depose them. But I don't have, the only reason I had a right to disobey an order is if it was unlawful or unethical. I couldn't depose the government. That's not called a democracy. That's called a tyranny. And anyone who's ever talked to me in my whole life, I'm now in my 70s, knows I strongly support evolution, never revolution. Why do I say that? I've had a career where I've been in some pretty awful places. I mean that sincerely. If you've never been in a civil war, if you've never seen a country where the army has taken over the government, then you don't know how horrible it can be. I would never support anything like that. Democracy's ugly. It takes time sometimes to get things right, to get things back on track. The army's job is to defend our country against external enemies and to defend our country should external enemies get in our country, but not against our government that's freely elected by the people. So if the people want a better government, they better step up and vote for one. And we need, in good governance, we need a real conversation about government recall. How do you recall a government through a democratic process, not through military force? I don't believe we've had a good discussion about that in our country. We need to talk about individual recall at every order of government, federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal. It needs to be achievable, but not easy. And we need a way to bring down a government when we see what's just happened in this country with a minority government, where a coalition no longer reflects the will of the people in a democratic manner.
Okay, so this is, I think you're getting at the heart of the matter, is we need good governance, and good governance also means respect for the parliamentary traditions and tools that are there in that spirit of serving the people.
Jump back in. It means far more than that. Good governance includes the whole discussion, not just about elected officials and not just about how we make legislation, but good governance also includes a free and independent media.
Yes.
It also includes free and independent judicial system.
Right.
There are so many pieces in good governance. They're not just about the elected officials, and we need to talk about all of them again, because we've seen a real attack on all of the pieces of good governance, and I described them in the paper as well, and we need to have a fulsome discussion about all of those elements. How do we get back to journalists that demand investigative journalism?
Right on. Okay, so that I think we're very much in agreement there. I like the point is that good governance involves a family of institutions that got to do their job. And that's been part of the challenge with this country, has it not? That we've got the media, some 2,000 outlets, as I recall, that are being funded by the federal government. And they've all got to sign on to this funding agreement to cover, what is it, climate change and see it as an existential threat to reconciliation, to what's the other issues? DEI. I mean, it's absurd. When you want a free and independent media that can speak truth to power, then you've lost part of your good governance. We've got institutions like, we've got so many universities. I don't know why the taxpayers funding them when they're teaching us for frankly, the next generation, many of them, I don't mean to wildly generalize, but many of them to hate our country. I mean, this is absurd, is it not, David?
Okay, so you've got two pieces there, and I'm happy to do both. So let's stay with good governance for a minute. The very idea of a democracy is based on a free, independent, hard-hitting, journalistic media.
Absolutely.
We can never have taxpayer dollars fund media. It cannot ever be allowed to happen. I understand all of the original reasons that it wasn't cost effective to get into small communities in Northern Canada. We're way past that. Our country has now got technology that makes it possible for every single Canadian to have a cell phone in their hand and get instant media anywhere in our country. And if we haven't, once again, we've failed. We need to
look at this show. Look at this show, case in point.
Anywhere. So the whole discussion about an independent media, it starts from the point that taxpayer dollars never fund media in any form, point final. Now let's go to academia. Academia, in my opinion, and the way I was taught, is grouped into education and training, and it fits into individual and societal well-being, the 6 national interests. And I believe the education system in Canada, which is a provincial territorial area of jurisdiction, needs to be refocused on reading, writing, and arithmetic. Okay, I'm an old guy and I use stupid old words, but it needs to be focused on STEM technology, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We need to go back and teach social studies and the history of our country, the proud history of our country. We need to break away from social issues and focus on academic issues. Now, people say to me immediately, well, how are children supposed to socialize? I'm sorry. Children socialize automatically. You put them in a classroom with 20 or 30 kids, they learn about what happens in the world by dealing with their peers, older kids in school, younger kids in school, like you and I did. You learn the hard way, you learn the easy way, but you learn about society and how it works together. And how do teachers build coherence within the class? They do team projects, they do this kind of project. But the children will automatically, through evolution, learn about society. But in our schools, we need to teach about our government and teach about our democracy, how it runs, not the terrible pieces of it, the functions, the pieces and how they interrelate, and about independent media and about an independent court and judicial system. We need to get back to teaching the basic things that children need to do, reading, writing, arithmetic, STEM, all the rest of that, so that we can excel in our economy and children will develop normally. So let me, in the paper, I talk about one of the things that happened, in my opinion, over our country. When I first started having children in the 1970s, there was this thing called helicopter parenting. Helicopter parenting was when your child was in a situation and something unpleasant was happening, you plucked them out. That's hence the term helicopter parenting. You made sure that they didn't feel in any way a bad feeling. You plucked them out.
David, this is making me feel very uncomfortable. Could we not talk about this?
Exactly.
Is that what you're getting at?
Okay. But we'll move on right away. But unfortunately, that 20 years of helicopter children turned into the next generation, which were called bulldozer parenting. So instead of being plucked out, the child was left in place, and a bulldozer parent would get a teacher fired that made their child feel uncomfortable. The child stayed, the teacher got fired, the professor in the university got fired. Bulldozer parenting and helicopter parenting have lasted us for 40 years. And what the basis of it all, what it turns us into, is as individuals, we believe that risk is not ours to manage. We've given up the idea of self-reliance and the ability to self-regulate yourself in dangerous and difficult situations, and we've transferred it to government. It's government's job to take all risk out of our society, and it set us up perfectly for the COVID emergency, where everybody said, lock me in my house, please. There's a terrible, scary virus out there. Government, you have to save me. And we gave up our rights and freedoms willingly, because we had 40 years of people that are now in their 40s, in fact, that are now running our country, that believe that risk is the responsibility of government, not the responsibilities of individuals.
Well, very interesting. What do you think about our guest's thesis about parenting and how that's impacted our culture? Those helicopter parents, those bulldozer parents, what do you think about that? Because this all affects our culture. And I guess what strikes me about this conversation is how these policy choices are all interrelated to come together to create either a high functioning, strong, united nation or a fractured, fearful, dysfunctional nation. We've got a comment here from Tom. When the government is in disrepute, as it is now, voters should be fully engaged in the political process itself. Absolutely. It's so critical to be engaged. So let us all join hands. It's interesting. I still remember the former past president, missive ringing in my ear, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. So let's all take that to heart here in Canada. And it's interesting when we talk about culture, I would really be remiss if I did not bring up the state of the Canadian military today. David, you know better than I the incredible history of our armed forces and the difference that Canada's made in many theaters right around the world. And it is atrocious, the state of the military today. And it strikes me that that type of lack of commitment to build our military has had a particular impact on our culture. What are your observations in that regard?
So the second of our national interests is national security. And the Canadian Armed Forces, in my mind, is the canary in the coal mine. It is completely destroyed from within and from without. And using the government's own words, we're 17,000 out of 71,000 short. And of the remainder, they say only 58% are deployable. That means you have under 34,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and women that are deployable. That's smaller than the New York City Police Department. And I'm using the government's numbers. I put it to you that we may find out it's even worse than that. So the canary in the coal mine says national security is broken, being the Armed Forces of Canada. And I'm happy to talk about the paper I've written on that I published last December. But let's talk about all of national security. It starts with a strong immigration policy. It's backed up by a strong intelligence system, an intelligence system that looks at threats before they come to Canada and evaluates threats within Canada. We've seen both those destroyed by the present government. We need to rebuild them, and we need to have a task force to rebuild them. It then steps to border security, and we need a border services agency that looks at land, sea, and air, a Coast Guard that is equipped and capable of standing off a distance in our ocean. But in our ports, we need to be checking more than 1% of sea containers. And at our legal border crossings, CBSA needs to be equipped and manned. But equally and far more importantly, on the unmanned border crossings on our 4,000-kilometer border, we need a border service that can do surveillance, target acquisition, and target neutralization, that can actually reach out and stop threats that are coming into our country before they get here through an immigration policy, before they get here through our use of our intelligence systems, but then with border services. Then as you step down, police of jurisdiction, the RCMP federally, provincial police forces and municipal police forces in whatever form they take, being credible and equipped to handle internal security problems. And then, of course, across all of that, an emergency management system that allows our governments to respond in a coherent, unified manner across all national security threats with full protection of our critical infrastructure. And by critical, I mean things that bring power into your home, food into your mouths, and the energy that we need to do whatever it is to carry on in our lives, guaranteeing our shelter. So we need to look at all of national security the same way we talked about the economy. We need to bring people together and have a complete look, soup to nuts, on national security across all of those elements.
Right on.
Coming back to the Canadian Forces, that's why I wrote the paper. And in the paper, I demand that a task force be stood up, that it has 3 months to define exactly, and I list the tasks given that they need to deliver, and then within 3 years to rebuild the Canadian Armed Forces so that the nation, our citizens, and our allies can look and see that Canada is taking its national security seriously again in the form of our national defense, and that we will be a secure partner in the future.
Okay, so you've summarized brilliantly, I think, the action plan there, the to-do list, so to speak, for national security. Right now, we have premiers butting heads on the strategy to respond to the Trump administration and their demands to get our act together in terms of security. And we know that, I mean, I've had other great guests on board. We've had these conversations with people such as Scott McGregor, intelligence analysts, He wrote the book called The Mosaic Effect that basically brilliantly summarizes how Canada is got a lot of security issues. Vancouver's a super hub for fentanyl production. To name one issue, I think we only inspect 1% of the millions of containers coming in and out of our ports. I mean, I don't want to lecture you on that status, but this is almost the story that Canadians, the media, seem to be totally missing, is that this is the issue. This is why the Trump administration says you need to get your act together, because what is it again? Oh, security trumps trade. Security trumps the economy. And unless we get that through our head, we will not be seen as the reliable continental partner building this incredible North America. That's the opportunity, isn't it, for Canada to rise to our challenge, to get our leaders' acts together and say, we're going to fix this up right now. Isn't it? Like, what if you were the prime minister today, what would you do, David? How would you deal with Donald Trump?
Number one, I would define a 25-year vision for our country, and I would form working groups to look at each of the areas of 6 national interests and have an open and transparent conversation with Canadians about what we need to do in each of those 6 areas to correct, to facilitate a move to the future that it makes a strong, coherent, resilient nation. Not a post-national state, the nation of Canada. And we need to have groups of people really diligently working on each of those in an open and transparent manner, so Canadians know the action that's being taken and can start to rebuild the pride in our country. But park that vision out in the front and then build towards it with real intense conversations in each 6 areas of national interest, subdividing them into each of those areas. So a full hard discussion on immigration, a full hard discussion on border services. We just heard it, political grab for tiny points to say, look, there, we fixed that. The newspaper announcement that we're going to buy a couple of Black Hawk helicopters, a 4,000 kilometer border-ish, there you need to do surveillance of on a continuous basis. So surveillance is the hardest element. You need to look everywhere all the time. Is 2 Black Hawk helicopters the technology you're looking for? I don't think so. Then you need to do target acquisition. And target acquisition, what surveillance does is it does detection, recognition, and identification. It used to be my specialty in the Army. So detection is something's moving. Recognition is it's a human. Identification is it's a human carrying bad stuff coming into our country. Then you need to do a target analysis. How are you going to interrupt whatever that target is? Is it a human? Is it a vehicle? What is it? Is it a ship coming into our coast? Is it what? And then you assign the correct assets, and then neutralization is you deploy the assets and you stop the threat. Those 3 steps have to be part of what we build into our border services. Now, some of the solutions to those might be the armed forces for standoff distances or our Coast Guard, but in our border services, we need to have the discussion about surveillance, target acquisition. So I'm not trying to make it have you educated in all of the different methods. There's tons of really smart people out of there. We need to bring them into a room and address these problems and not do a political announcement. Look, we spent $1 million buying helicopters. There, the problem is solved. How did that problem solve? Surveillance, target acquisition, and target neutralization. None of that was discussed.
So, what is it called again? Oh yeah, January 20th is inauguration day in the United States. You may have heard. So, what's your guess on what's going to happen there, David? I know you're not a betting man per se, but I mean, I tell you, I look at the premiers that are scrambling here, and we're trying to reassure people by buying, what is it again, 2 Black Hawk helicopters, as you talked about. How is that going to avoid possibly a 25% tariff? And I mean, how is that going to help out anybody is a larger question. But any sense of your guess in terms of what's going to happen?
I believe that President-elect Trump, then President Trump, will do what he does best. He will defend his own country. He will take the national interests, all six of them, and he will do what he believes is right for America. And we can agree or disagree whether it's right or wrong, but we as a country need to focus ourselves on our six national interests. And if he becomes a threat to the national interests of our country, be prepared to respond in meaningful but respectful manner, because at the end of the day, we share a continent with a superpower. And so folks, don't do things that are going to give long-term damaging relationships. That doesn't mean you don't stand up for yourself and use appropriate tools. But remember, tariffs, if first of all, he's talking national security. Secondly, he's talking economy. So he's talking about two out of the six national interests, and he's expressing his ideas in his own way. Judge him by what he does, not by what he says. I thought we'd all learned that from his first presidency. But when he does something, respond in an appropriate, respectful manner that protects the interests of Canadians across all six of our national interests, and then be ready to adjust and move forward for the next whatever. Because it's not just President Trump, it's NATO looking at us and whether we are going to be part of it or not. It's what's happening far more importantly in China, what's happening with the China funding going into Iran, which is marching in our streets. We have so many issues we need to be addressing. We need a government that understands the totality of the six national interests and has a coherent plan on how we're going to address them. So President Trump will do what he does, and we have to be ready to respond.
So I think you've got a very thoughtful response there, David. But you alluded to something that I think is very interesting, and this is the point. There's a whole series of things going on in this country that our elites, our leadership, don't seem to be doing a darn thing about. And I'll give you one example. It's a comment from our audience, from Tom again, who says, we still have 4 Chinese police stations operating in Canada. Both the government and law enforcement are aware of this, and it is beyond comprehension why they continue to operate. That is one of examples. Another one that you just alluded to, David, is the whole idea that there's a whole funding network, and this is well documented. This is not tinfoil hat stuff, of funding arrangements coming in from other nations, including Iran, funding operatives in this country to do all kinds of nonsense. So unless we're kind of all over this, like it just behooves the question, are we asleep? Are we lackadaisical and complacent? I mean, it's no wonder that I mean, time and time again, if you talk to our friends that are intelligence officers, they say that Canada's a joke on the international stage when it comes to our security. The Canadians just aren't aware of it. So we need to get with the program, don't we, David? Otherwise, how are we taken seriously?
So in that one discussion, we hit all 6 of the national interests of our country that have been negated, neglected, and intentionally, in my opinion, diminished. When we have sitting members of parliament that we know from the foreign interference inquiries have been willfully involved in interference in our legislative system, in our economy, in our businesses, we have destroyed the credibility of our intelligence services, because no matter how many times they brief a government does nothing, and the government refuses to release any information about the names of the people involved. We need a credible government at the top of this whole system that we built in our country, and we need to make a whole new evaluation of our country. And so, yes, I agree strongly with the comment that was made, and we have groups marching in our streets screaming for the death of Canada. Why are police of jurisdiction not doing their job? Why are people not doing their job? And if we look at what happened in COVID, and we look at all of the steps that got us here, we have Canadians that are sitting in their homes waiting for the government to fix all these problems. Once again, I will say I'm an evolutionist, not a revolutionist. It is time for Canadians to re-engage, to drive their members of parliament crazy, whether they be municipal, provincial, territorial, or federal. Phone the crap out of them, write letters to them, stand on the doorsteps of their provincial offices. Don't go to their homes. Make sure they know your opinions. Become involved in groups, become involved in politics if that's your bent, and try and make this country better from within the political system if that's your choice. Canadians need to reconnect with Canada, and I use that term intentionally. If you haven't read Eva Chipiuk's book, Reconnect Canada, go to Amazon and buy it. It's a fast read, it's an easy read, and chapter 5 is all about how you can actually influence the elected officials in our country again. Get back involved, Canadians, because as you are sleeping, the country is drifting away. And as I said in my paper, start and finish of both my papers, it's an anonymous quote from ancient Greece. Every country has an army, theirs or somebody else's. Right now, we're in the process of getting somebody else's, whether it's the Chinese, the Americans, is a coin flip.
Right on. So let us not be complacent. Let's don't twiddle our thumbs. And my question to everyone is, when have you last contacted your elected officials and spoken up? And have you had a heart-to-heart with them? Because you know what? I think you're absolutely right. If you're silent, you create a vacuum, and all they hear from then is the bubble that they're in and the special interests. Are they creating good public policy that will serve Canadians? I think not. So this is the question. So as an election is possibly on the horizon, we've had a prime minister indicate his resignation in March when the Liberal Party has chosen a leader. The parliament is being prorogued, paused. Is that a good idea? I mean, we've got a lot of business. We've just talked about this. I mean, our country is really is really challenged, to put it politely. Why are we proroguing the parliament, David, in your opinion?
So that the current prime minister can try to salvage any tiny piece of his legacy, and I don't believe there is one, and that his party has time to regroup so that it doesn't lose party status in the next election. It has nothing to do with the good of Canadians, and he knew it, and he did it intentionally. This country should have had an election announced before Christmas, and we should be at the polls as we speak to elect a government which has a strong assigned task of unity of our country, to be ready for whatever happens on January 20th, but far more importantly, to develop and rebuild a vision for our country based on the 6 national interests and pull our country forward from this last decade.
Okay, so there you have David Redman's take on that. We have a question from Michael Melanson. If national unity is one of the 6 areas of national interest, what does Mr. Redman think of the current government's promotion of First Nations as nations within Canada that are comparable to Canada, e.g., bilateral relationships, nation to nation, as they say?
I believe, in my opinion, that we have a very proud history. We and our First Nations people came together in many different ways, and we can certainly learn from some of the damages. But let me give it to you that in the United States, the policy was extermination. It was cohabitation in Canada, and I love our history far better. But I think the Indian Act should have been dissolved at least 50 years ago, and that the First Nations should communicate and work with us to build a unified country going forward. And I believe that our country should stand together with all of the peoples, sharing common ethics and values in a manner to go forward, recognizing our past history and incorporating it where it should be. But folks, maybe I can just give you a humorous anecdote that might help understand where my position sits. I'm a Celt, okay? I'm a Celt. Part of my origins are from Great Britain, and I was a proud member of the Celtic Society. And then first those damn Romans came and they took my land away. And then the Angles came and they took my land away. And then the Saxons came and they took my land away. And those damn Normans came and they took it all and they kept it. Do you see anyone realistically in Britain demanding that the Celtic people be given back their ancestral lands and not be part of the United Kingdom? Folks, we have a country and it has a history with warts, but it also has a history that we should be extremely proud of. And I say to all First Nations, let's build a country together that is the best country in the world and that represents and protects certain Aboriginal rights as we should, but that builds us as a unified group that can take on any threats, foreign and domestic, and be economically prosperous across every tiny piece of our country.
Right on. So there you have it. David Redman, you've just articulated, I think, an exciting vision for a country, questions, a process, a call to action for not just simply our leadership to remember the foundations of our country as we go shoulder to shoulder in unity, but also you've challenged us as citizens to come together to be able to speak up and do our duty and our precious responsibility as citizens to help build this country and to renew it. So in 2025, it's been great to have this conversation, David, and I'm really glad on behalf of all of us, including our audience, and I want to thank them as well for their myriad of questions and comments for joining us today. This has been a great far-reaching conversation, and I want to wish everyone a great 2025. So thank you very much, David.
Happy New Year, everyone, and let's build Canada into the country that we deserve and love.
Well, terrific. So have a great day, everyone, and be sure to join our conversation next week, the same time, same place on Leaders on the Frontier. We appreciate your likes. Please share this conversation. If you think it's important, not only for you, but for the next generation, be sure to share it, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.